Good evening and welcome to the National Arts Club. I'm coming to you live from the former Tilden bedroom on the second floor of the National Arts Club building, aka the Tilden Mansion, a National Historic Monument. This is an Architecture Committee event, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Chin Dao, and I am on the Architecture Committee. And this event is highly anticipated to talk about the TWA terminal, renovation, and hotel addition. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Having trained as an architect in the UK, Miriam specializes in the repair and adaptive reuse of some of England's most important historic buildings, including Windsor Castle, Abbey, and the Royal Pavilion Estate. Since joining Beyer Bender Bell's New York office in 2014, she has worked on projects for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Frick Collection, New York Public Library, Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Hispanic Society Museum and Library, which is currently ongoing, and Longwood Gardens, which I just visited 2 weeks ago. Miriam holds 2 master's degrees in architecture from the University of Edinburgh and is a scholar of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, SBAB, and a fellow in the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. She joined the UK's Register for Architects Accredited in Building Conservation in 2012. She serves as an advisory board member for the New York Memoirs Conservancy and as an adjunct professor in adaptive reuse at NYU. And now, without further ado, Miriam Kelly.
Thank you, Chen Dao. Hope you can all hear me this time. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you very much for the invitation to present to the National Arts Club. We've really enjoyed working on the TWA Flight Center building. So without further ado, I will share my screen and tell you a little bit about the history of the building, the reason why it became disused, and then walk you through some of the key steps that we made to transform it into its current use, which is as a hotel there at JFK Airport. So the TWA Flight Center was designed by Eero Saarinen and Associates for Trans World Airlines, and it's one of the most significant examples of mid-century modern architecture. Since its opening in May of 1962, the building's expressive form has defined the modern airport terminal, and it served, of course, as a metaphor for flight. The building was one of Eero Saarinen's last designs and also one of his most revolutionary. Sadly, Eero Saarinen died in September of 1961 while undergoing a surgery for a brain tumor, and he didn't live to see the TWA Flight Center completed. Over time, the Flight Center has undergone a number of compromising modifications in order to try and adapt to the changing aviation industry. And when the TWA company ceased trading in 2001, the terminal was closed to the public and it was threatened with demolition. But for the last 24 years, Beyer Bender Bell, along with a lot of advocates and with the New York and New Jersey Port Authority, has led a series of projects to stabilize the building and restore this important landmark. So a little bit of introduction to Eero Saarinen. So he was born in Finland in 1910. His family emigrated to Michigan in 1923, where Eero was with his father Eliel, who was also an architect. Eliel Saarinen worked extensively across the northeast of the United States, and in particular helped to create the architecture at the Cranbrook School of an Academy of Art. The work that he did when he first moved to the States was very much in the arts and crafts style, and it was a real family collaboration. You see in the image at the top there, Eero Saarinen with his father Eliel obviously both big pipe smokers. And they collaborated extensively throughout Eero's childhood on projects, with Eero often designing the furniture for those projects. Eero Saarinen then went off to Paris to study sculpture. And then he went to Yale before joining his father's practice in 1936. Other important collaborations for Eero Saarinen include Florence Knoll and Charles Eames, who we see in the bottom on the middle. And Eero Saarinen really loved furniture design. That was probably his first love. And then he moved into architecture. He's pictured on the top right with Kevin Roche, who together with John Dinkeloo founded Roche Dinkeloo Architects and actually took over Saarinen's firm after his death in 1961. We also see on the bottom right-hand side his wife, second wife, Aline Bernstein-Lockheim, who was the art critic for the New York Times. Saarinen's first wife was Lillian Swan, who was a quite well-known sculptor. So a little bit about his projects. So we see here on the top examples of some of his early work. He initially worked in the Mezzanine tradition, quite orthogonal, precision, modular rhythm were themes of his projects. His first independent work was the vast General Motors Technical Center in Michigan. And this was followed by the Bell Labs in New Jersey, which was recently restored, and the headquarters for IBM, the John Deere factory, amongst others. He also designed the Dulles Airport project. And then on the lower level, we see his movement towards a more sculptural style. So he's moving beyond the constraints of modernism. And here we see the Cresca Auditorium and Chapel at MIT. We see the Ingalls Hockey Rink at Yale and the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. And if we compare these buildings on the top and bottom rows, we see that the top buildings are modular, they're extendable, they are adaptable, whereas the buildings on the bottom are complete, they're highly resolved, they're object in field buildings, which is something we'll talk about in a minute when we talk about TWA. And some context on JFK Airport. This airport was conceived in the 1940s. The city purchased 1,600 acres of land over in Jamaica Bay, an Idlewild golf course, and the airport was actually known as Idlewild for many years. They developed a series of different designs for the airport, but it was expanding at a very rapid rate. And in 1948, the airport had quadrupled to about 5,000 acres. And that led in 1955 to the development of the terminal city, which we see pictured here. This was designed by Harrison and Sullivan, and it comprised the Central International Arrivals Terminal with 7 smaller terminals for domestic airlines, all located in a 60-acre landscaped plaza. Each terminal was designed individually to have its own corporate identity. And the airlines really took advantage of this opportunity to compete with one another for the best air terminal design. TWA was the last terminal to be completed. You can see it here on the bottom left. And Saarinen located the new building directly on axis with the airport entrance road, which we see here at the top right. And so he's seizing the opportunity to really dramatize the approach to the building and monumentalize that view of the flight center. It's always fascinating to me to think about how this building with all its complex geometry was designed before the age of computers and architectural design. It was commissioned in 1956 and completed in 1962. And Trans World Airlines commissioned Saarinen to design a building that would really develop its reputation on the cutting edge of the aviation industry. They wanted it to, quote, represent a daring departure from conventional air terminal concepts. And Saarinen really took this idea and ran with it. He wanted his building to express the excitement of travel, to reveal the terminal as a place of movement and transition. And we really see that coming to the fore in the sculptural form of this building. And of course, it's a break from the orthodoxy of modernism. The TWA terminal contributed to a revival in architectural expressionism in the 1960s and was one of the earliest freeform thin shell concrete buildings. And the building emerged from an iterative exploration of sculptural geometry, both in two-dimensional drawings, but also very importantly, in these large-scale three-dimensional models. And we see Saarinen's feet sticking out of his large-scale model as he's obviously in there exploring and refining some of the sculptural experience of the interior of his building. The Flight Center was also a technological success. The collaboration with the structural engineers Amam and Whitney pushed the boundaries of sculptural concrete and really pioneered the development of thin shell construction. It's a highly innovative concrete structural system, and it's essentially made of 4 independent segmental concrete shells. And these are collected on the roof, and they come together in one central point in the middle of the roof. As they span outwards, they're supported on 4 piers. So the whole of the roof shell is really only resting on 4 points where it meets the ground. The shell is 50 feet high and it's 315 feet long. Then below ground, there is a dense structure that is post-tensioned and then connects all of the structural forces below the ground. The concrete mixes used on the project were innovative as well. And they were designed specifically to meet the unusual shape of the building. Standard concrete was used at the piers, but a very special mixture of a blended lightweight concrete mix was used to pour the roof shells. And the roof was cast in one continuous pour, which lasted for 5 days and used 10 million pounds of concrete. So in itself, logistically, it was a really impressive building just from a construction standpoint. And here we see the building completed. And something to note here is that one of the many innovations of the Flight Center is that it developed something called the satellite configuration of airports, airline terminals. And this was an innovation that Saarinen pioneered. And here we see set aside from the main terminal, the satellite flight wing, which enabled direct contact with passengers going out on a bridge out to the flight wing from where they boarded their plane. So it's the separation of the flight wing out to from the main terminal, which is important. And of course, that's a feature that we experience very frequently as we fly today. It's been a theme of airline design that's certainly been picked up by the industry and used extensively. Also in this image, we see how the use of concrete was very consistent. This is a concrete building. It's a building that really wants to express the sculptural nature of that material. And Saarinen didn't just contain that use to the building itself. He used it in the forecourt and arrivals driveway. He used it on the plane tarmac where the planes would sit. So this whole area of the airport was really defined by the use of concrete and the expression of concrete. A little walkthrough now of the building. So here we are arriving as if we were in 1962. We're arriving at that wonderful primary axial view at the front of the building. And we see the small parking lot just in front. And we also notice these rather elegant custom-made light fixtures for the front of the building. And as we approach the building, we are invited inside by this very sculptural, swooping porte cochere, which extends out as a warm welcome and scoops us into the building. So there's this invitation, a sense of flow as we move into the building. And once inside, that sense of flow continues with this sinuous concrete where everything is a flowing surface. There's really very little horizontal or vertical line here. Nothing stops. So as a passenger who's about to take flight, you're sort of swept from the outside in and through the building. And you see in the background there that very elegant, gradual flight of stairs that sweeps you up and out to your aeroplane. So the interior is one large vaulted space, sculptural flowing elements, and it's establishing this consistent overall aesthetic between the interior and the exterior, which of course gives this maximum impact of experience of this building. And then flanking that entrance hall, we have 2 side wings. One of the side wings that we see here on the left is the ticket wing. And this is obviously where people would come and check in before their flight. And we also see in the foreground this 15-foot high information board with a Solari flip-flap split rotating information. So every sort of 10 minutes or so, it go click, 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 and switch the flight information. So everything's dynamic and activated. On the left hand, on the right hand side, sorry, you see the baggage carousels. These are an invention of Saarinen. The mechanized baggage carousel is something that Saarinen invented, and of course is still with us today in many shapes and forms in the aviation industry. This is a stainless steel round baggage carousel, and this really transformed the speed at which people would receive their baggage, again, as part of this seamless flow in and out of the building as a passenger. So a few more views of the inside of the building as it was when it was first opened. We're looking here from the mezzanine, looking down on that beautiful gradual staircase. And at the top of that staircase on the upper level, there is what's called the Sunken Lounge. This is a heart-shaped red plush seating area sunken into the surface, and that is a key waiting area. It's sort of the heart of the building. It's where passengers would wait to be called for their flight, and it's in front of this wonderful east window, which becomes a viewing gallery from which one can sit and watch the planes on the tarmac outside and get excited. We're building the excitement for a flight. Once your flight is called, you have the extraordinary experience of going down the flight tube, which is, I think, a rather otherworldly experience. You can't see the end of the tube. The curvature of the floor is such that it blocks your view for the other end. So it's really sort of a leap of faith as you go to get your flight. Very dynamic space and rather famous. It's, of course, featured in a number of films. Having got to the end of the tunnel, you were then in the flight wing, where you would then board your plane. The flight wings were demolished in, I think, 2005 to make way for the construction of the JetBlue Terminal 5 at JFK Airport. So going upstairs, there were 4 bars and restaurants which were arranged at the mezzanine level, which is a very open space looking over the arrivals space below. And we've got 4 bar and restaurants. We have the Ambassador Club and the London Bar on one side, and the Lisbon Lounge Paris Cafe on the other. Now, Saarinen had authorship of the Ambassador Club interior. He designed that in conjunction with Charles Eames in particular, but with also some furniture by Florence Knoll. There has been a persistent rumor that the fountain in this space was the work of Isamu Noguchi. In our archival searches, both with the Noguchi Foundation and in the Saarinen archives, we found Saarinen's design drawings for that fountain, and no records were found in the Noguchi archive. So from that, we feel fairly confident saying that that fountain is in fact by Saarinen. The other 3 bars, the London Bar, Paris Cafe, and Lisbon Lounge, were designed by the industrial designer Raymond Loewy. Raymond Loewy was commissioned in 1960 by TWA to design a new corporate identity for them, including their logo. This featured the colors of gold and red for TWA, and these colors were the ones that Saarinen was sort of given for the project, so he very much incorporated them into the rest of the building, and that's where those colors came from. They were designed originally by Raymond Loewy. Now, of course, if anyone has flown as a passenger through this terminal, you may remember that it was always very crowded. The security requirements, the capacity of aircraft, and the sheer number of travelers were not fully anticipated at the time that the flight center was designed in the mid-1960s. To give you some context, in 1956, the Lockheed Constellation, which was the flagship aeroplane for TWA, that would accommodate 58 passengers. And it's really around that aeroplane that Saarinen designed this terminal. In 1958, Boeing 707 came into service, and that seats 150 passengers. And by 1970, so just 8 years after this terminal opened, the Boeing 747 came into service, seating 660 passengers, a tenfold increase on the design that Saarinen had been exposed to in the mid-1950s. So you can understand that very quickly this terminal was just too busy. It was too small to accommodate those larger aircraft and passenger numbers. And unlike Saarinen's design for the Dulles Airport terminal, which was a modular design, this building was much more difficult to expand. And essentially, sadly, the terminal was largely obsolete by the end of its first decade. So some of these photographs, if you've flown out of the terminal, may be familiar to you. But here we're looking at some images from the 1990s, the sort of faces of misery as people wait in long lines. And here we see on the bottom a sort of building chronology, which shows how the building was adapted over time. So we see that it was actually initially constructed in 1962 with just one flight tube and one flight wing. Of course, Saarinen's design was that would be symmetrical, but that flight wing wasn't added until 1967. But in 1967, Saarinen's building was essentially completed. In 1970, significant extensions were added to the sides of the building, these sort of bat wing shapes that we see. And they were used for baggage and ticketing. In the 1990s, yet more expansion, again for baggage, also some security. And it was during the 1990s that the Sunken Lounge, that heart-shaped seating area in the heart of the building, that was removed during the 1990s. In 2001, the TWA company ceased operations. The building was closed and it became threatened with demolition. And then in 2008, the flight wings were demolished to make way for the JetBlue terminal. And so between 2002 and 2008, Bayer Blindebel worked with the Port Authority to help stabilize the flight center and also to advise on its redevelopment. We see here some of the photographs from the late 2000s. As part of this effort, we assisted in putting together the Historic American Building Survey, or HABS survey, which helped to register this building as an important building. And in 2005, we put together a successful nomination for the Register of Historic Places. In 1994, TWA had already been designated as a New York City landmark, which is actually well before the 50-year threshold for this building. So it was already having a degree of protection and advocacy around its future. In 2007, the Port Authority issued a request for proposals, or an RFP, for the development of TWA. And the prevailing response from developers was really that the cost of restoring the existing building should be borne by the Port Authority in order to yield a feasible business plan for its adaptive reuse. And so the Port Authority commissioned Bayer Blindebel to develop the phase 1 restoration, which was focused on stabilizing and securing the interiors of the building. And so here we are. We undertook a project between 2008 and 2012 to do a partial restoration of the terminal. We removed some of the inappropriate additions from the inside of the building. We restored some of the glazing, particularly around the entrance. And we resolved some issues such as leaky roofs and repairing membranes and so on to secure the envelope of the building from water penetration. And over the years, of course, with metal detectors, X-ray machines, baggage carousels, etc., being added to the building, some of those original Saarinen features had been removed. Here we see what was left of the Sunken Lounge in 2008. We also see that the purple hue, which was a UV film which had been applied to the glazing, which gave the interior of the space this rather ethereal purple haze. The building had suffered from a lack of maintenance for many years. And so we set about restoring the primary interior spaces, the central lobby spaces. And so the Sunken Lounge was, of course, one of the main focus points. And we were very lucky for this project because Saarinen's archives, all of his drawings survive in Yale archives. And it's wonderful to go and be able to handle those drawings, to really study them. And we have all of his construction drawings. And so that enables us to really restore literally lost elements in this building. And that was the decision in the Sunken Lounge, was to use his original drawings to literally put back what was originally there. Of course, on some projects where information is not as readily available, it's controversial philosophically to literally restore something because it always involves a degree of conjecture. But here, because we have the benefit of that information, we were able to restore. So we restored the flight tubes to jet blue. We put in some new life safety and fire alarm systems to make the building safer for occupants. And we also had a major campaign of repairing the penny tiles. So these little tiles, they're 1/2-inch diameter, they cover the surface of the interior of the building. It's like fish scales. So that we've got this sinuous curving architecture, and they are covered in these millions of small ceramic buff colored tiles. In our repairs alone, we used 3.5 million penny tiles, and these were custom manufactured for the project. They matched exactly the original penny tiles in the color of the matrix, the aggregate, the texture, their size, but we also overlaid some modern requirements such as slip resistance and water absorption to make them more durable. And as you can imagine, this is quite a painstaking effort to restore the original 1960s penny tile surfaces. So one of the things that we were thrilled about, having completed the restoration, was that it was able to be open for periods of time to the public. And so there were special events held in the flight center after that first phase of restoration. And here we see in 2015 an Open House New York event. And we were always surprised by the level of public interest and popularity of this building. People would come out on a weekend out to JFK in their thousands. I think on one weekend for Open House New York, we had 4,000 people come through the building just on one weekend. And so it was a really vote of confidence really from the city about their interest in this building, and I think really helped the Port Authority to recognize how significant it is as a piece of architecture. And so in 2012, the Port Authority issued a second request for proposals for the development of the building, and this time it was successful. In 2014, MCR, or Morse Development, led by a gentleman called Tyler Morse, they were elected as the developer for this project. And they worked over the next year with a company called Lebrano Chiavara Architects based in Brooklyn. And then the following year in 2015, Bayer Bell was engaged by MCR and was brought on as the overall project architect. And the project was for a hotel use for the flight center. And so how would that work exactly? So the hotel has got 3 components. We've got the restored TWA flight center, which is very much the heart of the project. We then have 2 new hotel structures, which are constructed in those orange-pink areas at the back of the building. And then the third component is a major events center, which is actually fully underground. It's located underground where that star is between the 2 flight tubes, and it's where the tarmac of the aircraft used to be. And the total square footage for the project is 400,000 square feet. And so thinking about how those 2 new hotel wings would offer something architecturally relevant and supportive for this rather magnificent and unique building was a challenge. But we went back to the initial concept of the building. So if you think back to that diagram of JFK Airport that we saw at the beginning of the presentation, Saarinen had anticipated that you would approach this building from a distance on the access road of JFK Airport, and you would see this magnificent shape, this swooped shape, ready to take flight from a distance as you approach. It's a figure in field relationship. However, over the years, of course, the JFK Airport has been heavily developed, and not least the development of the JetBlue terminal at the back of the building has been constructed. So that figure in field relationship of this building in splendid isolation set against the sky, that's rather been lost. So really the impetus of the two new hotel wings behind the building is to reestablish that figure in field relationship. It's to try and put a sort of fairly neutral background against the back of the building to block out the noise of the other buildings around it, and to clarify the historic flight center and reset it in the airport context. So here we are, we've got the 2014 condition that we see on the far left, which has got those funny batwing extensions from the 1970s. And the impetus is to restore the footprint of Saarinen's original building by removing those batwing extensions. And that gives us the space to then add those two blue volumes, those curved shapes, which are the two new hotel wings. And so in plan, that's the batwing, hatched gray, coming away from the back of the building. The red line is us restoring Saarinen's original footprint. And that enables us then to have the breathing space to create those two hotel wings, north and south hotel wings, with 512 guest bedrooms. We see here the diagram, which enables us to keep the original circulation plan of Saarinen's building. So we enter the flight center, that's the front door of the hotel. You check in on the left-hand side. We have food hall on the right-hand side, but you move forwards as you would in 1962 if you're going to get on your plane to the Sunken Lounge. You get that wonderful vista out of the back of the building. You can then choose your flight tube as if you were going to get on your flight, but instead of going to an aeroplane, of course, you're heading to your hotel room, connecting into the flight tubes. Here we are restoring Saarinen's original footprint, just to give you some idea of what went on in construction. So we've demolished the bat wings, and you can see there revealing the curve of the original building facade, which we then restored. And to say that working in the flight center was quite difficult because it's a concrete building. It's very difficult to adapt these sorts of structures. So there's a lot of hand tools, working in quite confined spaces to put in new mechanical and electrical services and so on. So this just gives you a flavor of what it was like during construction. We also did a lot of work to figure out the concrete condition of the building. And I'm pleased to say that it's actually in very good condition. We did a number of tests on the shell and also with infrared and x-rays to see how deep the reinforcement bar is buried and the condition of it. And it was in good shape. One of the philosophical challenges of the project was that the building was originally a concrete color. It was exposed concrete. And then over time, quite quickly after it was built, there was a concern about the durability of that concrete as it was weathered. And so it was actually overcoated very shortly after it was completed. And you see in the bottom middle image, the original concrete. And then you'll see a sort of creamy colored, buff colored layer. That's one of the early coatings, which was also concrete colored. And then in 1996, you see the white, off-white colored coating that was added to the building. And there was a lot of discussion in the team. Should we go back to that original concrete color, or should we keep the existing white color that we've had since 1996? This went backwards and forwards quite a number of times. We see here the original concrete color from 62. Here it is in just after completion in a couple of years ago, 2019. And after a lot of debate, the client very much preferred this white building. And I think because it had been white for so many years, the public generally thought of it as being a white building, even though it was originally a concrete building. So it was decided that we would be overcoating in white. So that's the sort of rationale and genesis behind that decision. The glazing was an interesting issue. So there are 238 trapezoidal large single glazed panels on this building, and they were needed to be replaced. A number of them had failed. The gaskets that were holding them in place had completely failed. We'd hoped that we would be able to put in double glazing to improve the thermal performance of the building. However, unfortunately, the structure, those bow trusses that you see on the upper left-hand image, they are structurally at the top of their range. They're maxed out. So we were not able to add additional weight with a double glazed system, and so we kept a single glazed system. However, we did put on some heat resistant coatings. It's tempered glass, and we went back to Saarinen's original specifications. We were able to match the color of the glass to his original. We also replicated the gaskets that he used originally to fix his glazing systems in place. So inside the building, a few shots sort of before, during, and after. So you can see a 1962 shot of the ticket wing, and then as it was when we started the project in 2014. And we did a lot of careful work cleaning and restoring these original Saarinen spaces. It was a light touch, but we were trying to bring the experience of those spaces back to how it would have been experienced in 1962. And that contrasts with some of the spaces that were very badly damaged over the years, and from which all this original detailing had been stripped out and lost. So here we have an example of one of the former baggage halls, which really didn't retain any of its original fixtures and finishes anymore. And so rather than trying to sort of do a replication of what was there originally, we took the decision to, in service of the building's new use, to transform some of these spaces into function and event spaces for the hotel. And so here we see a ballroom, which is designed very much in a contemporary style. It's clearly not by Saarinen, but you see that some of the shapes and the colors and textures that we used try to connect the dots and be complementary to the Saarinen interiors. And here we are, a view looking down over the mezzanine to the lobby space below, with that really famous TWA red carpet. Some other smaller details around the building. The shoe shine was restored. Parts of this did survive, and we were able to uncover other parts of it that were lurking behind 1970s paneling. We also were able to restore the telephone booths. This is part of the museum exhibit, actually. If you pick up a telephone receiver, you can hear a recording of some of the stories of the TWA Flight Center as part of today's experience. The signs, the signage around the building was an important feature for Saarinen. You see in the central image that lovely sign for the London Club, one of the bars upstairs. None of these signs survived. However, we did have Saarinen's original drawings, including the fonts that he designed and used for the project. So working with a signage specialist, we were able to make new signs to Saarinen's original designs for this project. Here we see a view of the lower lobby with that wonderful clock that actually was not original. It was from 1964, but we kept it. It is within the National Registry period of significance. We're looking out there to the parking and arrivals, and we see that big information board, which houses the Solari split flap board. Solari is still in business. They're based in Italy, and they provided the original information boards for the building. And so we commissioned them to replace the boards, and with their new updated split flap systems. We have two in the building. One is located here in the lower lobby. The other is in the Sunken Lounge, as it was originally. And the Sunken Lounge has been rather spectacularly restored and is now a beautiful cocktail bar, one of many on the site. It's very difficult not to have a cocktail during a visit to TWA these days. Also in the foreground of the image on the right, you'll see the plaque from 1961, which memorializes Saarinen as the architect of this building. Of course, never sadly got to see his building completed. Here we see another sign, the Hughes wing, which is one of the hotel wings, the south wing, and the restored flight tube. Going upstairs, here we are on the mezzanine with the restaurants that were lost. These are Raymond Loewy original designs, but the interiors of these Raymond Loewy's restaurants did not survive. And so we have furnished them in contemporary furniture, but again, with a flavor of the 1960s. and then the Paris Cafe. And then heading over to the other side of the mezzanine, this is the Ambassador Club, which was the first class lounge for TWA. Lots of famous people passed through here, from popes to the Beatles to, you know, pop stars, movie stars. It's got quite a storied history. And we see the image here of 1962. This is an Ezra Stoller photograph. These were extremely important to us because we were able to get some good color indication from these color 1962 photographs. And here we see it in 2014. A lot of the fixtures survived, which is great, but they're in obviously poor condition. And so we set about doing a restoration of the space. We looked back through the archive drawings. We tried to understand what elements had been lost. A couple had. So one of the planters had been lost. This curvy bench had been lost over the years. And so we were able to, again, going back to the drawings, restore those faithfully using Saarinen's details. What was remarkable for us as architects was finding in the Yale archives the original material samples. We see in the middle of the slide here, the samples of the carpet, the velvet for the upholstery, and the leather for the seats in the Ambassador Club. This is gold dust for us because, of course, we can then accurately match colors. We can get the TWA color and the textures as well for the different furniture elements very accurately using these this amazing resource. Also, the planter drawing that we see there on the bottom, that was used to restore the original marble planters. So moving on now just to talk about the hotel wings themselves, just a few minutes on the hotel wings and the event center. So the two hotel wings are constructed, as we've mentioned, at the back of the hotel, and framing it, they contain 512 guest rooms. And the idea for the circulation is to go in through the front door of the flight center, down through the flight wings, and then to connect through the flight tubes into the hotel wings themselves. And we did this by attaching a small glazed link, very subtle and discreet, we hope, that connects the hotel wings to those flight tubes. This enables Saarinen's original design for the building to be respected and for people to move through the building as it was originally designed. And we see the construction of the flight tubes. They're basically steel hula hoops clad in stucco. So it's actually fairly easy to make a hole in these to connect with this new glass connector. Something else to talk about is the curtain wall for the hotel wings. So we're, of course, at the airport, and sleeping next to the runway can be quite tricky. So there was a lot of emphasis on the curtain wall design. In conceptual terms, we looked to Saarinen for some examples of his projects, how he had dealt with the rhythm of glazing, the proportion of glazing, and also that gentle curve of the Neues house in particular, which was very relevant to this project. And we see here what it takes to acoustically insulate a hotel room on a jet runway, which is 7 pieces of glass in a big sandwich, triple glazed, with extruded aluminum fins, which also have acoustic separations. I've spent a couple of nights sleeping in the hotel, and I can tell you it really is very quiet. It's kind of uncanny. You would never know that you were sleeping at the airport. And here's a view of it. Of course, that gentle curve seeks to really support and strengthen the curve of the original Saarinen building. A quick shot inside a hotel room. So we've used, it harkens back to the 1960s in a contemporary style. So we've got Saarinen's womb chairs and other examples of his furniture. Of course, no hotel room from the 60s worth its salt would be without its martini bar. That's obviously essential. And then, of course, we've got contemporary bathrooms and all modern comforts. So moving on then to the roofs of the hotel wing. So we took the opportunity to occupy the roof terraces. And so we see here on the right-hand side on the hotel wing overlooking the runway, this rather magnificent swimming pool. And that's been very popular with guests to soak in the waters and then watch aircraft taking off from the runway right next to you. The other thing to note is on the opposite hotel wing, on the North Hotel, we've got the cogeneration energy plant. the hotel is not on the electrical grid. It has its own independent energy center, which was actually the first of its kind in the world. It consists of 3 reciprocating engines, which were made in Austria. And it has a large energy output, but it's very efficient because it recaptures any heat made by those engines and uses it to heat the hot water and for space heating. And it's 74% more efficient than the original 1960s energy for the building, and it's 29% more efficient than a traditional on-grid building. So an important innovation for the project. Moving on to talk about the event space, which is located under the tarmac here between the 2 flight tubes. So this is a 30-foot deep excavation, and you'll remember that this airport is built on Jamaica Bay in a swamp. And so there were 4,000 gallons of water per minute were pumped out of this excavation during construction. And you get a sense of the scale of it, particularly in the photo on the bottom right. But here we are creating a large ballroom surrounded by meeting rooms. And so we've got a generous ballroom, double height with 45 meeting rooms. And indeed, around the sides of the space, we've got spaces for events and gathering, but also are animated by these wonderful collections of TWA memorabilia, which the client has collected. And in fact, people who used to work at TWA, a lot of the air stewardesses and pilots have given a lot of their uniforms and other memorabilia to the project so that it can be displayed at TWA. Last piece in the jigsaw puzzle is the Connie. This is, when we look back to photographs of the building when it first opened, it's often captured together with a 1960 Lockheed Constellation aircraft. This was the absolute pioneer aircraft that was invented by TWA, and it became the backbone of their fleet. This was an important aircraft because it was one of the first pressurized cabins, which enabled more comfortable flying above the clouds and also enabled longer distances to be covered. So it's an important historic building and was designed at the same time as the flight center. And so our client was able to buy one of the 4 remaining Lockheed Constellations still in existence, and it went up to Maine to be painted beautifully in the TWA livery, and then it was driven back down to JFK and came through Times Square to great fanfare shortly before the project opened. Here we see that the Connie being winched into place, and the interiors were inspired by the Starliners of the 1960s with this very luscious facilities for cocktails and socializing. And the Connie is today a cocktail bar on the tarmac there outside of the building. And so, you know, we remember that view from the 1960s from the Sunken Lounge, looking through that wonderful big window out to the tarmac and seeing an aeroplane and getting excited about the journey. And we still can do that today. Here's the Connie back home at TWA, and she's sitting now alongside the building that was designed really for and around her. So with that, I think that was my last slide. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to have any discussion or answer any questions.
So Ed from Iowa City had a good question. You said designing the furniture during childhood. How young was he when he first started designing or working with his father?
I think it sounds as though he was really very young. I mean, he moved to the States, I think, when he was about 10 years old. And at that point, his father, Alil, was working at Cranbrook, and his family, his mother was a textile designer. His sister was also involved in some of the projects, his younger sister. And I think really probably from when he was about 10 till, you know, throughout his teens, he was probably involved designing the furniture. And that's really something that informed his sculpture studies when he went off to Paris to study sculpture. And then he pivoted. It was common at the time in the 60s. We think of Breuer in particular, another famous modernist who was a furniture designer first and then found architecture. So these things, I think, in the Bauhaus tradition had a much more close relationship than we might give them today.
Amazing. The second question is also from Ed. Did TWA entertain other potential designs and select his, or was there like an open competition, or they said, Saarinen, you're the guy?
Oh, from the original design, that's a great question. I think there was an open competition. I would have to remind myself of the details, and I'm sorry not to have that knowledge right to hand. But yes, I think there was a competition at the beginning, and I believe that Saarinen obviously won that competition. And there's actually a very good PhD study that was being done, and I can certainly share the link after the talk, which does give a lot of the backstory to the generation of TWA at JFK, and a lot of the politics and decision making and the branding, particularly with Raymond Loewy, that great industrial designer who, of course, designed for Coca-Cola and designed all kinds of amazing things. So yes, I think there's a very energetic design phase during the 1950s surrounding TWA.
I have to insert my own question here, because it's an urban legend or legend, and I'm not sure if it's really true, and I might be confusing it with some other design, but I heard that he kind of stole the design from a student who was presenting sort of like a folded plate concrete design for something else. Have you heard of anything?
I've heard of a number of stories. There's one about eating a grapefruit or an orange and arranging there's all kinds of urban myths. And I think also with the Utzon design for Sydney Opera House, which the competition was in 1956 at the same time as the commission for TWA, there's I think a lot of urban myth crossing over the paths there as well. So yeah, I haven't heard about the student story.
Oh, okay. I might be confusing it with another project, but yeah. Okay, well, so you don't know, and I feel like you would know, so we'll leave it at this isn't really a question, but I'll pose it as a form of a question. Some of the interior shapes and forms remind me of the Galaxy Soho in Beijing. Was Zaha Hadid influenced by Saarinen?
Oh, I'm sure that she was. I think Zaha, well, firstly, I think she's an absolutely extraordinary architect, and it's such a shame that she left us quite so soon. But yes, I think that this building from Saarinen, along with some others that he designed, the Ingalls hockey rink, for example, at Yale, springs to mind. They were so influential in the mid 60s and the 70s, when a lot of the architects of Zaha Hadid's generation were sort of coming up, in eschewing the kind of the rhythmic orthodoxy of modernism. They're sort of branching out into new expressionist style, and I think that really did have a huge impact on Zaha, and I'm sure other architects too. So yes.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it seems so very obvious. So the next two questions are really green related. So one is generally, were you able to green this building? And the other was the glazing enough to pass the energy code?
Right. Yeah. The answer to the last question is no. So as a landmark and historic building, the energy code, we have some relaxations, which we needed on this project. There is no doubt that the single glazing on this building doesn't help it. We did as much as we could in terms of coatings, applying coatings to the single glazing to try and limit its heat transmission and absorptions. But yes, I mean, the big south-facing glazed panels certainly do take the heat, and that does then put the emphasis on mechanical systems to dissipate that heat. So that's one of the reasons why the cogen plant is so important, because not only is it serving the new buildings, which are very energy efficient, the hotel wings are extremely energy efficient and designed as such with that very thick glazing, but it also, with that great efficiency for the cogen plant, which is of course 30% more efficient than most other systems of their kind, we do try and offset some of that, the issue with the building overheating and being less energy efficient. But it's always a trade-off with historic buildings, because there's a limit to what you can do while maintaining character. In some buildings, you can really, err on the direction of energy efficiency, but this was not one of them, unfortunately.
Right. You probably know when double glazing came into existence, and it doesn't seem like it was very common up until I want to say the 90s. But.
Right, I'd say sort of late 80s, they started to become more prevalent. And so a lot of the buildings from the 60s and 70s, if anyone works in buildings of that era, or perhaps lives or works in one, you'll know that they can get pretty chilly in winter and pretty hot in summer, and condensation is always a major issue as well.
Okay. A current question, so can the hotel be visited right now for?
Yes, it's open. And I have a friend who went there, I think last weekend, and was very pleased to see that the restaurants are back in swing. You can still have a cocktail. And so, yes, the hotel is trading and feeling lively.
You don't have to be a hotel guest?
You don't have to be a hotel guest. No, you can go and have a meal. You can go on the way to catching a flight. And also you can, I believe, buy a day pass to use the rooftop swimming pool if you want to go and take advantage of that.
A good day for that today.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so this is a great question from Rosemary. What was the reaction to the building in the 1960s? It reminds me of the terminal at LAX, the same period, but did it have a range of reviews or?
Yes, it was not very well received in some quarters in the 1960s. I think people didn't quite know what to make of it. It was so unusual. In the context of JFK, we think about some of the other terminals. Sadly, they haven't survived from the period. So we think of the Pan Am terminal in particular. There was a lot of groovy sort of space age type of design going on at JFK. So in a way, this building was amongst friends out at JFK Airport, and it didn't have sort of close neighbors. It wasn't in an urban context, which often brings about the most challenge. But Saarinen's peers in the architecture world kind of slated him for this building for many years. And it was only, I think, sort of toward the 80s and 90s where people started to be more accepting generally about the importance of this building. Of course, there were some people who celebrated this building from the outset and recognized its virtuosity. But I do think that at the time, there was a lot of grumbling in the architecture community that Saarinen had sort of gone in this more expressionist direction.
That's interesting. We'll have to look up to see if Ada Louise Huxtable did a review of it.
Oh, she did, yes.
She did?
Yes, I think she liked it, though. I mean, Ada Louise Huxtable was pretty bang on. She also liked the Met Breuer building, which a lot of people absolutely hated in 1966. She really supported that building. So she, I think, was ahead of her time.
She was very good, astute. This question is from Peter. What was involved in obtaining the rights to the TWA trademarks? Do you know that?
Oh, yes, I know the client. This is really something that the client led, and we as architects didn't have too much involvement with, but they certainly did work with TWA, or what's left of the organization, to get those rights. And yes, and so they've used them in the project. You'll see them sort of around the building in the furniture and some of their branding. And I know that they were thrilled to get them. So there was obviously a process there with what's left of TWA.
Amazing. There must be something left.
Mm-hmm. I think they also designed a font based on the Saarinen font as well, especially for this project with Pentagram, the graphic designers. So there's been a whole lot of work kind of in terms of branding and bringing the TWA message sort of forward as part of the project. Amazing.
This is a great question. Pragmatic. Dina says, what a massive undertaking and such a faithful restoration, but how long was your research phase?
Oh, yes. Good question. Thank you, Dina. It was long. So BBB, Bio Blinder Bell, we've been involved on the project for 24 years. And Richard Southwick, my colleague and boss, has really this has been a project that he's worked on all the way through with great tenacity. And so I came onto the project about 6 years ago and inherited a lot of the good research that had already been ongoing to put together the national registration documents, the the New York landmarks designation reports and so on. So those are a huge body of work that had already happened. And then my role was really going out to Yale and digging through the archive, which was a delight. It's absolutely joyful to go and handle Saarinen's original hand-drawn pencil sketches and his technical drawings, and of course find those materials. So I would say that we spent at least 18 months kind of fact finding and gathering that level of detailed information as part of our early design stages.
Outstanding. Okay, so this is a really good question as well. What was the cost of the restoration and the hotel creation? Can you break it down?
Yes, I think it's about 250 million. That number is public. It's online. So I think I can't remember the exact figure, but it's of that order.
Amazing. But do you know the breakdown between restoration and hotel creation?
Not off the top of my head, no. Right.
All right. A very specific question from Andrew. Is that a replica of an upper deck of a 747 lounge that he saw in the Connie picture? And if, where is that at the hotel?
Yes, it is. So we created, not very literally, but we were inspired by the starliners of the 1960s and 70s. And so the cocktail lounge, which is inside that aeroplane, the Connie aeroplane, which is parked at the back of the building, you can trundle up the steps as if you were getting onto a flight, and you'll be greeted by someone who will serve you a cocktail today. So if you go out to the hotel, you're welcome to go out to the Connie and have a drink. But you will have to wear your 1960s, 70s outfits if you're going to do that, if you're going to do it properly. So just a forewarning.
If you don't have one, you have to buy one. Do they sell it there at all?
I'm kidding.
All right. Oh, a similar question. So I guess this is more about architects who were inspired by Saarinen. Do you know if Gehry has ever attributed his work to inspiration from this building?
Well, I've often wondered that. I think that's an interesting point. I don't know enough about Gehry. I haven't sort of read enough on him to know that specifically if he's directly attributed to Saarinen. But I often think of the way that he's got a lot of sculptural form. And I think, the way he arranges sort of curved individual elements and sort of stacks them next to each other reminds me in some ways of the roof of this building. So I wouldn't be surprised if he did. I think this building was so well known, alongside others, that I'm sure that architects who are sort of established today can't help but have been influenced it in some way, shape, or form.
That's amazing. I have to interject my own question here. Now, the form seems somewhat like organic. I want to say it's like a manta ray or a moth or something like that. Do you know if Saarinen was, influenced by more like organic forms or more sculptural, structural furniture type forms?
Well, I think this is my personal view, but on this project, I think he was influenced by more organic forms. I think that you can see his, I don't know if you remember the photograph I showed of all the three-dimensional models with his feet sticking out the back of the model. You can see on the wall behind him in his studio all of this iteration of these sculptural forms. And to me, they actually look like horseshoe crabs. They've got these curved backs. The way that the flight tube plugs into the back of the building reminds me of the talus of a horseshoe crab. This is just my personal take on it. And I think he was going organic in this very expressionist way. So I think I don't see too much of that in his. I guess his furniture was also, but his furniture was a lot more kind of constrained, and so I think this is more of a natural exploration.
Yeah, it seems very different. There seems to be, even though your presentation was quite good, there's some sort of lost period there between furniture and building.
Right. Yeah. Too much to say about Saarinen, isn't there?
Yeah. All right, we'll try to get to a couple more here, even though we're over time. So I guess this is Dina D is giving her input, and she says, yes, eating the orange was how Utsun resolved his geometry. So I suppose she was having fruit with him that day. So did Saarinen's design anticipate the terminal's later expansion, adding the second flight wing?
So Saarinen's design certainly anticipated the second flight wing. It was very much a symmetrical bifurcated plan. What it didn't anticipate was this absolutely exponential rise in passenger number. And it certainly, as a building, has been very difficult to adapt all the way through. And indeed, for this project, it was difficult to adapt, to put in new mechanical systems, for example, to put in accessibility for ramps for disabled and for wheelie trolley bags that we all carry these days. So while it was a very forward-thinking, ambitious building, it was also quite sort of fixed in time in that it hasn't really had that much flexibility. And so one of the ways we've got around that is by trying to use the interior very much in the same way as it was originally. So for restaurants, so for check-in, those sorts of things. So we've tried not to change it too much on the inside, partly because it won't let us. So.
Amazing. This is from Bridget. What kind of objects are housed in the TWA museum collection, and does it store at the terminal?
Oh, yes. So the museum was part of the memorandum of agreement on the purchase of the building for the client. And so so it's something that was designed in from the inception of the project, which is very exciting. And so we've got all sorts of things. We've got stewardess uniforms from the TWA stewardesses over the years. One of them is actually made of paper from the 1970s, which is kind of amazing. We've got Howard Hughes's desk. Howard Hughes was the founder of TWA. We have a sort of mock-up of Saarinen's drawing office with some of his pieces of equipment, his drawing equipment. There's history of TWA, history of JFK, and but I think my favorite ones are the stewardess uniforms because they kind of stand in a little century run at the top of the stairs on one of the mezzanines, and they're absolutely extraordinary to see.
Amazing. Has the sign been retained?
The sign is a copy because that did not survive. So the TWA signs at the front of the building on those posts are copies, replicas based on Saarinen's original drawings. But yes, they're not original because they did not survive.
I don't know if I understand this question, but maybe you will. Is the space in the World Trade Center still there?
Yes, I do understand this question. So at the very top of the World Trade Center, MCR, the client for this project and owner of the project, have their offices. And while this project was being constructed, they created a miniature sunken lounge on the 86th floor of One World Trade. And it's positioned such that you can see JFK from up there. You can see the planes taking off, and they've got binoculars, like one of those old-fashioned ones that you find down at the beach, where you can look through and see the terminal. So, and they had events. They still have it. Well, COVID notwithstanding, they would have events in that sunken lounge. And it's a great space, and they had some of their museum collection, and I think some of the archives for the TWA collection located there as well.
Amazing. That leads me to another question, very much related to that. So was your research strictly limited to Yale, or what other sources did you use? I know you talked about people doing research before you.
Well, there's been quite a lot written about this building over the years. There was a very good PhD, which I mentioned, from, I think, a Danish student. It's really excellent history. Yale for us was the most useful because we were trying to get to the drawings, to get to the technical side of the project. But the other resources that we really found valuable were photographs by Ezra Stoller and Balthazar Korab. The latter is in the library in Washington. And those gave us such a great insight to how the building was originally looked. It's one thing to have the technical drawings, another thing to see how it was all brought to life, both in color and in black and white. It also enabled us to see the things that we couldn't find. So we couldn't find any of Raymond Loewy's interiors. There was also a restaurant in here by Warren Platner from 1970. He's a famous interior designer who invented the soft fabric walls, the knitted walls. I don't know if you remember those, with the artist Sheila Hicks. So we were not able to find original technical information about those, so we relied on photographs to get the essence of those spaces that have long been lost.
Wonderful. Well, that's good. And I will end off, since we're about 15 minutes over, with one last question, which I think is a good lead in here. Marie says, I hope Beyer, Bender, and Bell, all architectural firms, are faithful about keeping their records and supporting their archives. What would this work be without preserving the intellectual, not just the building past? So that's a really good question. Like, how do you preserve, perpetuate, that kind of thing, your records of restoration and your research into it?
Yes, great question. Yes, well, we do is the answer to that. I think architecture firms generally are quite good at that for various reasons. Some of them are, legal reasons, keeping hold of records after projects are complete and so on, but also for posterity. Not all projects are going to be as important and studied, of course, as this building, but nevertheless, it's important to keep records, which we do both digitally and in paper format, including physical samples and supplier records of where we've obtained samples. So yes, and of course, that's helpful not only for our clients maintaining their buildings in the future. We often give them a little package when we finish a building to help them know what we've done and what materials we've used and how to look after their building. But also then we have storage both digitally and physically that we keep of all of our projects in perpetuity.
I would also hope that perhaps you would give the records to Yale. What you did.
That's an interesting question. I actually haven't thought of that, but yes, that would be nice to do.
All right. Well, this has been a fantastic presentation. I think we had about 350 attendees, and we're still at around 230. So with that, I would like to thank you very much, and Beyer, Bender, Bell, for lending you to us for this presentation. And you are welcome at the National Arts Club anytime.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, guys.